Good afternoon. I guess we can get started. I'm Jim Dorn, Vice President for Academic Affairs at the Cato Institute and editor of the Cato Journal. I'd like to welcome you to today's book forum, which features Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, published by Random House. The book is available outside the auditorium, and I'm sure Gordon would be more than happy to sign it for you after the forum. We also are very privileged to have with us today two leading China scholars to comment on Gordon's book, Ming-Hsin Pei of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Liu Juning, who's now visiting fellow at Harvard University. Before getting started, I'd also like to mention that the Cato Institute will be hosting a major international conference on pension reform in Beijing on November 8th, and there's some brochures outside that describe the program. You can also see the program and register for it if you're interested at the Cato website, www.cato.org. Also on the Cato website, you can find a copy of the recent Cato Journal, which deals with Hong Kong's legacy and China's future. Now, the title of Gordon's book is extremely provocative. That's probably why he chose it, The Coming Collapse of China. The questions that come to mind are, what conditions would have to hold for a regime collapse? And how probable are those conditions? And third, what alternative scenarios are there to a total regime collapse? Well, we know the Soviet Union collapsed, but could China collapse in the same fashion? Or will the regime change be more evolutionary rather than revolutionary? Or will the Chinese Communist Party continue to maintain its monopoly on power even as the economy is liberalized and China joins the WTO? Those are important questions, the answers to which are by no means obvious. China faces serious problems, from the fragile nature of its banking system to the lack of secure property rights, and, of course, the lack of overall human rights. Now, as the non-state sector of the economy has expanded, the Chinese people, no doubt, have become better off. There's clear evidence of this. And they will, at some point, demand a greater say in government. There have already been subtle changes in the political landscape over the last 15 years that Ming-Hsin Pei has written about. They'll also demand a freer press in the information age and more secure property rights. But at some point, the Chinese Party, the Communist Party, is going to have to make a choice of which road it's going to take. That is, whether it's either going to relax its hold on power and let liberal institutions sprout up and grow over time, or whether they will clamp down harder as people demand greater rights. The decision that the party makes will have profound consequences, and that's why Gordon's book and this topic is so important today. Gordon argues, and from a wealth of experience in China, that the collapse is imminent. It may, not that it will occur 20 years from now, but perhaps 5 years from now. And he's here to tell us why. So you may disagree with him or agree with him, but the point of today's forum is to have a good discussion of the key elements that are confronting China now, the key problems, and see what the alternative solutions might be. I'm very pleased to welcome Gordon here. Gordon really just moved from Shanghai to the States. He's living in New Jersey now, and we're glad he's back here to be able to discuss his book. Gordon holds a law degree from Cornell University, where he also attended undergraduate school. And he's, as I said, he's lived and worked in China. He's been there for nearly 2 decades. First, he was in Hong Kong with Baker McKenzie, and then he most recently in Shanghai with a counsel to the American firm Paul Weiss. So he's got a lot of legal experience to bring to bear on this discussion. He's worked in the courts in Shanghai on litigation issues. which he'll discuss later. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Asian Wall Street Journal, the International Herald Tribune, and the South China Morning Post, among other leading papers. This, by the way, is his first book, so hopefully there'll be more to follow. Gordon, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you, Jim. People down under sometimes call their homeland the lucky country. And indeed, Australia is particularly blessed. But as we look around the world, which nation would we say is the unlucky one? My choice is China. Do I choose China because the Chinese have suffered 2 centuries of misrule, or because they have an outlook which is unsuited for success in the 21st century? Well, both of those statements are true, but that's not my reason. My reason is much more simple, immediate, and important. To understand the points, though, we need a little background. Today, China presents the image of success. Beijing's leaders tell us what a great job they're doing, and they have reams of statistics that back them up. Foreign experts, especially economists in this country, tell us that the People's Republic has a bright future. And it's easy to believe that when we think about the potential of China. We extrapolate, we multiply, and then we let our imaginations run wild. The consensus is that the leaders in Beijing have found a good formula for sustained economic development. One American economist in the middle of last year said, "China's stars never seem to be in better alignment." And then he continued, "China's time is now." Well, now that China has been awarded the 2008 Summer Olympics, and it's about to join the World Trade Organization, who among us could be pessimistic about the future of the world's most populous country? Well, certainly not my father. In September of last year, he and I stood at the top of the world's 3rd tallest building and looked around. That's the Jinmao Tower in Shanghai. And as he did that, he said, "Oh, I bet all the foreigners are surprised and jealous when they see all of this." Well, yes, but if I had to summarize my book, The Coming Collapse of China, in just one sentence, I would use these words. The Communist Party of China, the organization that tells us that it's going to rule for all time, has just a decade more, and perhaps just 5 or 6 years. Nothing in this world lasts forever, and that's especially true of a society that has an unsustainable economic and political system. So talking about its demise is long overdue. Coming collapse, if it has any startling message at all, says this: the end is near. For most of us, it's inconceivable that the modern Chinese state could fall either now or far into the future. But that's precisely the conclusion that we'd all arrive at once we strip away all the false statistics, the public relations hype, and especially if we stop taking at face value all that China says about itself. In the 4-year period from 1997 to 2000, in a period of increasing business failures, layoffs, social unrest, the leaders in Beijing have told us that the rate of urban unemployment has remained constant at 3.1%. That statistic is completely ludicrous, yet foreign experts accept at face value another astonishing figure, that China's economy grew in the year 2000 at 8.0%. That's a big jump from growth in the year before. And in 2000, Beijing says that it turned the corner from deflation to inflation. Well, my wife and I lived in Shanghai for 2000, and we saw no turnaround in the economy at all. I wrote Coming Collapse because we could see what was happening in China. And what was happening was not the China that was being described by the foreign experts. So what is happening in the China of today? Well, the most important thing, of course, is that China is just about to become a member of the World Trade Organization. And everybody agrees that the WTO will bring great changes to China. Do you know what? They're right. In the past, we could see that the Communist Party, in its very skillful manipulation of the economy in the reform period, was able to produce the world's fastest economic growth, perhaps the fastest in world history. Change was impressive, and the China that we see today is so much better than the China that was existing at the beginning of the reform period in 1978. In fairness, though, we should put that in perspective, because during this period and up to now, China has been accountable to no one. It set the rules and administered the game, so of course it got the results it desired. The story in WTO, however, will be different. Tariffs will fall, internal barriers to trade will be eliminated, but perhaps those are not the most important changes that we will see. From the day that China joins the WTO, it'll have to abide by that organization's rules on fair trading, and it'll become subject to the International Dispute Resolution Mechanism. The changes will be dramatic. Everybody knows that China is not prepared for WTO accession. In Beijing today, structural reform of the state-owned enterprises has been essentially deferred. A little while ago, the world's favorite Communist Party leader, Zhāng Jiādūn, declared victory in his 3-year campaign to make the SOEs profitable. But even state media acknowledges that most of those profits were really derived from a fortuitous increase in the price of world oil. Also, China's statistics for the state-owned enterprises don't include the massive subsidies that the central government gives the SOEs, and we do not know to what extent fabrication and economically useless production has enhanced those statistics. However, we don't really need to sort out the good numbers from the bad, because in the WTO era, profitability really won't matter. It's competitiveness that counts. And in the WTO era, the SOEs, despite their improved profit picture, are really no more competitive than they were before. That's because they've made relatively few preparations for accession, and they continue to assume that the ministries in Beijing will in the future, as they have in the past, continue to protect them. But that's wrong, though, because in WTO, we want to summarize it, competition will be unforgiving, and WTO rules will bind the hands of the ministries. So we know that that won't occur. One analyst in Hong Kong said that of the 1,100 Chinese enterprises that are listed on the domestic stock exchanges in Shanghai and Shenzhen, only a handful will survive accession. Now, I don't quite think it's going to be that bad, but we can all agree that the shakeout will be horrendous nonetheless. The story is much the same for the state-owned banks, which include among them some of the weakest financial institutions in the world. Insolvent and backwards, these banks are kept afloat by the central government, which cannot afford to see them fail. There have been recent recapitalizations of the state banks, but even after that's been finished, the banks are still insolvent. They're still under a pile of non-performing loans and bad debt. So their rehabilitation is well over the horizon. The reform era has failed the banks as it has failed the state-owned enterprises, and the banks are not ready for competition in the WTO. When Western experts talk about the financial system, they always talk about the banks and the big four banks, but we often forget the sickest children in the household, which are the rural credit cooperatives. And we don't talk about the unmentionables on the family tree, which are all the illegal deposit-taking companies. Beijing is trying its best to ignore a reform of them, so we really can't be too optimistic about the financial system in China. So now we know that the enterprises and the banks just really won't do well in WTO. The consequences for the economy will be severe, perhaps even critical. Not everybody agrees, of course. Exports and foreign direct investment will ride to the rescue, we are told. Unfortunately, what we are told is terribly simplistic, and worse, terribly wrong. Those who say that foreign investment will mushroom after accession just ignore the reality of what's going on in China today. China suffers deflation because there's overcapacity in every segment except for perhaps telecommunications. Overcapacity in China is matched by overcapacity around the world in every segment. If you are a manager of a foreign multinationals' operations in China. Of course you want more foreign investment so that you can build bigger facilities to take advantage of the emerging national marketplace. But if you're an executive back in London, Paris, or New York in the Home Office, what you want to do is use idle factories around the world and export to China. You need proof? Well, Volkswagen, let's take a look at the bellwether industry in China, which is automobile assembling. Volkswagen has more than a 50% share of that market. Yet even Volkswagen says that even with its dominant market share, that its factories in China will not be able to compete after a recession because they have a cost base which is 30% higher than factories around the world that also make automobiles. General Motors is committed to manufacturing on the mainland. They have put in about $2 billion over the last 5 or 6 years, yet even General Motors is going to import car parts and even whole cars into China. And we have to remember that the world's most efficient car plants are just 2 days away from China by ship. In WTO, the tariffs on automobiles will drop from around 80% down to 25%. So what's going to be the effect of that big decrease in tariffs? We got a hint of that in the beginning of this year when China voluntarily reduced its tariff rates on automobiles by a small percentage. In the very first month that happened, the number of cars imported into Shanghai increased by 150%. You think that's a fluke? For the first 6 months of this year, the number of cars that have been imported into China increased by 118%. And to put that in perspective, the number of domestically produced vehicles increased by only 22%. Well, will there be any increase in foreign investment after China joins the WTO? Yeah, of course there'll be. But the increase won't be as big as people predict, and the boom won't last as long as people expect. So those who believe that foreign investment can save China have just misperceived the future. Let's take a look at exports, that other thing that's supposed to save China. Well, it's a fact, and you can look it up, that export growth has been sputtering over the last 2 years. And I think that that trend is going to continue over the next 4 or 5 years in China and the WTO. Those experts who say that China's exports are going to boom in WTO conveniently forget the fact that the main thing that's keeping China's export machine going are export subsidies, and those are going to end in WTO. So now we know why China is not going to be saved by either exports or foreign investment. But there's one more reason, more important than all the others, why China will fail. China, as I mentioned before, is the unlucky country. It's the very unlucky country. China spent so many years negotiating, and I thought it was very clever in trying to get into the GATT and then into the WTO. It thought that by playing hard to get, it would get a better deal. Well, the deal it got was pretty lousy from their perspective, but that's not the real story. In the beginning of this month, we could all see that the world was headed into a coordinated economic downturn. We could see evidence of that in this country, Western Europe, and even in Asia. Then came September 11th, Black Tuesday. After Black Tuesday, we're not just looking at a recession. We're probably looking at a downturn, which is the worst since the Great Depression. And China is joining the WTO at precisely this point. So what's going to happen as China joins the WTO? Well, first of all, look at the multinationals. They're probably going to try to export even more to China after a recession. And the reason's a very simple one, and that is that they look at their home markets, which are drying up, as consumers are refusing to consume. So probably the amount of exports to China will be much larger than we thought at the beginning of this month. And then if we look at exports, the other side of the equation for China, that's not a pretty picture either. Because even if they could export, who are they going to export to? And when you think about that question, think about another one, and that is, after Black Tuesday, where are the multinationals going to get all this capital to invest in China? So you can throw all those optimistic projections about China in the WTO out the window. They weren't very good before Black Tuesday, and even now there's clearly more off the mark. Today, even with 8% growth in China, the country is suffering from more and more social instability. The demonstrations are becoming more and more, even according to Beijing's own statistics. They're becoming larger and larger, and worse, the protesters are becoming even more desperate. The central government seems to cope, it seems to get by from one demonstration to the next by one means or another. Sometimes it tries to buy off the mob, and other times it tries to use brute force, but in the not too distant future, when things get worse, it just won't be able to cope. Today, the central government tries to cope through massive fiscal stimulus. And that's the only thing that's keeping the economy going. Massive fiscal stimulus means ever-increasing budget deficits. Today, that situation looks okay. Because if you look at the traditional ratio of public debt to gross domestic product, and that public debt, I should just mention, that's not the debt of the policy banks or the other instrumentalities. That's just sovereign, pure sovereign debt, both domestic and foreign. So if you look at this ratio of public debt to GDP in the year 2000, it's about 22.9%. And to put that in perspective, that's certainly manageable because the internationally recognized safety mark is 60%. Yet, if we want to know how much China can borrow in the future, we have to add in the hidden obligations. Merrill Lynch, at the beginning of this year, issued a research report which said that the debt to GDP ratio was not 22.9%, but was 120%. I think that 120% is understating the case. First of all, you have to add in the unfunded pension obligations. The central government sort of mumbles when they talk about unfunded pensions, but the number that I use is about 850 billion US dollars. That number comes from the Bank of China, and it's not the highest number that you're going to find. And then if you should add in all of the indirect loans to the state as we calculate our public debt to GDP ratio. If you do that, the indirect loans from the state-owned banks to the state-owned enterprises is about, in the year 2000, somewhere in the neighborhood of $861 billion. But to be more conservative, what I did was I took a different number. I took all of the loans in the banking system and looked at which ones were non-performing, and of those, I looked at which ones were non-recoverable. If you look at the non-performing loans in China's banking system, it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%. Standard & Poor's says 70, but I took 50% to be conservative. And of that, I said about 20% were recoverable. The assumptions I used were not the most pessimistic that you can find, and I came up with a number of 490 billion. Well, if you take the 490 billion of the non-recoverable loans in the banking system, you add that to the $850 billion of unfunded pension obligations, and then add that to public debt, come up with a ratio of somewhere just shy of 150%. We'd come up with an even bigger number if we had reliable GDP statistics and if we had a better idea of the extent of China's hidden obligations. Now, we could quibble all afternoon about these numbers, but at the end of the day, we're all going to come to the same stark conclusion. Beijing is running out of money, and it's running out of something even more precious, and that's time. It has a few years, perhaps 5, to get things right. Now, those are the 5 years when the worst effects of WTO accession will be felt. As a general matter, China could be a beneficiary of WTO accession, but that's only going to happen down the road after structural reform has taken effect. In the beginning, there's going to be pain. There's going to be more business failures, more layoffs, more social unrest. And that's inevitable because Beijing is trying to cure 5 decades of economic mismanagement with the shock therapy of WTO. Those optimists among us who say that from here the road leads straight up for China are just ignoring common sense. The next 5 years will be very rocky. Talk about bad luck. Those are the 5 years when China is going to go through a political transition. That's the time when the 3rd generation of leaders makes way, or doesn't make way, for the 4th generation. Beginning in 2002 and ending in 2003, almost all the top posts in both the party and the government will change. China has gone through 2 political transitions before now. Neither have gone according to script, and neither have been smooth. And we have no reason to think that this one is going to go smoothly either, especially because the party is split at the top over various issues, including WTO accession and admission of private entrepreneurs into the party. So when, in this 5-year period, when the challenges to China will be the greatest, the regime will be at the weakest. Now, we all think that there's been great economic development, which is true, and we think the progress must continue. But we shouldn't take it for granted. Because first of all, most of that progress occurred during the era of Deng Xiaoping. In the last 5 years, we've only seen gradual and slow progress. Is China doing the right thing? Well, I don't think so these days, and we could argue about this one as well. But at the end of the day, I think that we would all say that what we see in Beijing, we can all see evidence of solutions that with time and political will work. But whether China's doing the right thing or not is not the issue. When the People's Republic of China falls, historians are going to say that the government in Beijing ran out of time. Today's emphasis on gradualism and orthodoxy and slow, leisurely reform is just not consistent and appropriate for a country facing the massive problems it faces, or for that matter, a world where the pace of change is accelerating. Let's throw out all these words and this analysis. If we really want to know what's going on in China, we should be looking at what the Chinese people think. We don't have to ask them because they're voting with their feet. Official statistics say that of those Chinese students who go abroad to study, only 1/3 return. And if that's what the government is telling us, of course the situation is worse than that. In the middle of last year, 58 Chinese died in the back of a truck escaping their country, and we know that others die in containers coming to this country. Human smuggling out of China has no parallel in any other country. But let's talk about this on a personal note. My wife and I know a woman in Shanghai. She loves her son more than anybody in the world. Last year, she said to her son, "I want you to study abroad, and I never want you to come back to this country." We should talk to the people of the People's Republic if we want to know what's going on there. They can tell you much better than I ever could. And we should be listening. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. We'll now hear from Ming-Ching Pei, followed by Liu Juning, and then we'll open it up for questions, and I'm sure you have many questions. Ming-Ching Pei is an old friend. He's spoken at a number of Cato events, both in China and the U.S., and he taught at the Princeton University before he came to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he's now senior associate. At Princeton, he taught East Asian political economy and international relations. He's the author of From Reform to Revolution, The Demise of Communism in China and the Soviet Union, published by Harvard University Press. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Foreign Affairs, and the Asian Wall Street Journal, in addition to many prestigious academic journals. Ming-Ching holds a PhD in political science from Harvard. Ming-Ching.
Thank you, Jim. I'm really privileged to give a short comment on Guthrie Chang's book. I would like to make three sets of remarks. First, I want to say that Gordon's book is a very timely and important piece of work which raises a set of very important and serious issues that people ought to think about when they debate where China is going. He has raised economic, issues that include financial sector problems, the fiscal weakness of the Chinese state, state-owned enterprise reform, structural adjustments, and post-WTO economic shocks that China has to absorb. Politically, he has identified power transition in Beijing, corruption and rising tensions between the state and the Chinese society. He's also alerted us to China's deteriorating international environment, such as an unstable relationship with the United States, and also the challenges posed by the independence movement in Taiwan. So I think these issues are clearly among the most important for both scholars and observers of Chinese politics. People like us think about these issues all the time, and we also worry about their implications. The second set of remarks I would like to make appear to contradict the main thesis of Gordon's book, that is, China's collapse is imminent. Of course, Gordon gives us a very flexible timeline, anywhere between 3 years to 10 years. I'm not going to pin him down on the precise date, because if I know and I trust Gordon's judgment, I was short the stocks in Hong Kong for that day, because I can not only prepare my family, which is still in China, for the political disaster, I personally can also benefit handsomely from this meltdown. As an academic, I wouldn't call myself a political scientist. As an academic who has actually studied regime collapses around the world, I will caution all of you that regime collapse itself is a very low probability event, which itself is triggered by the simultaneous outbreaks of several crises, which themselves were low probability events. So which means that the probability of regime collapse clearly exists in China. But I'm not going to say it's 85%. At the moment, I would likely to say it may be 5 to 10%. It exists. But if you are accustomed to percentages rather than yes and no kind of perspective on regime stability and collapse in China, and I think you will come down to a much more conservative conclusion regarding the political future of China. And here I want to underscore my point that regime collapse in China may not be imminent, and it would be extremely hazardous for us to guess or even to predict when that will happen, for two sets of reasons. First, let's look at the economic problem, because I think Gordon's main argument rests on a strong belief that China's economy is going to collapse. In the short term, largely because of the confluence of weak fiscal, financial, industrial foundations, and an external shock produced by WTO entry. So let's look at these issues separately. Fiscal conditions in China are certainly not something the Chinese government is very proud of. By historical standards, Chinese fiscal capacity is at their weakest. But official numbers do not tell the whole story. When you talk about China's fiscal capacity, the numbers can range from 50% of GDP to 24 to 30% of GDP. So there's a long range. And if we take the middle, the median number, that is China's tax revenue is around 24% of GDP, then China's fiscal conditions are not that as precarious as we think. And also the overall indebtedness of China's state. What matters is not just implicit public debt. Implicit public debt, of course, has long-term consequences on the borrowing capacity of the state. Explicit public obligations have real economic consequences because they involve servicing debt servicing, debt repayment. And if you look at that picture, I think it will be hard for us to come to a conclusion that China will run out of money to service its debt, because most of its debt is implicit. However, going forward, say 10 years from now, will the Chinese state be able to raise debts? That's a different issue. And on the other side, I think we're not going to minimize China's economic challenges. I think knowledgeable economists in the West, and I here especially recommend the work of Nicholas Loddy at Brookings, has long been calling our attention to those problems. But people like him also point to a set of economic conditions that appear to mitigate the negative or catastrophic effects of those economic problems identified by Guthrie Chang. And I go over this very short list. First of all, despite all the problems, Chinese people still have very high savings. And high savings rate is a structural condition that's going to stay with China for some time to come, and high savings rate does keep the banking system solvent and maintains a relatively high level of internal investment. Even though FDI may not rise to the level that people dream about following WTO entry, China's FDI level remains very, very high, in the range of $40 to $60 billion, the highest in the world for a developing country. And that can, again, offset other problems. And China's state-owned industries may not be competitive, but the fundamental restructuring of Chinese industry has occurred in the last 20 years. The most competitive industries in China are not state industries. So if we are interested in cops counting, then we look at SOEs. But if we're interested in looking at where China's industry is headed, we go to the private sector, the foreign investor sector, and these sectors are very dynamic. And if you look at the industrial landscape in China and see where exports are being created or produced, these are the sectors. And if you ask CEOs of American companies where they are going to move production facilities, not for exports to China, but for exports to other markets, they will identify China. China is now being regarded as the new manufacturing center for the world. And another one factor that speaks in favor of the Chinese state is that they do have closed capital accounts. And that firewall does create stability and prevents the similar kind of economic meltdown that Indonesia has experienced. And finally, I want to say that over the years, the Chinese government may not have learned how to be democratic. One thing they do appear to have learned is how to manage their macroeconomy. And the skills of macroeconomic management in China today probably rival the best among the developing world. I'm not going to say they're as good as the Fed. Political risks. As an academic interest in political changes in China, I do see that the lack of political reform has created a set of enormous risks for the Chinese state. But do these risks arise to the level as to threaten the existence of the current regime? I have my own doubts for the following reasons. First of all, there's no viable, organized, nationwide opposition. In order to overthrow a regime, you must persuade the people that there's a better alternative. Otherwise, they're going to stay with the devil they know rather than the devil they do not. And up to now, incidents of social protests has been rising, but they've been confined to local areas. There's no nationally organized, coherent social protest movement. And public opinions indicate, I mean, there are public opinion polls, and there are pretty good data regarding those generated by those polls. These polls do show two contradictory trends. One is increasing disillusionment with the Communist Party and its ability to deliver good performance. On the other hand, there's also this growing fear of instability. And I think on balance, probably the net effect is neutral, because you're not going to have a very agitated populace demanding change, given that kind of sentiments. And the third trend is that elite co-optation by the Communist Party has been remarkably successful. As a result, China today has an interwoven network of interest groups, each of which has an interest in maintaining the status quo. And that's important because forget about peasants and workers. They're not going to lead a revolution. Revolutions are led by elites. As long as the elites, social elites, political elites are on the take, you can talk about corruption, but that's not going to create a revolution. And finally, I think the Chinese government itself has learned some lessons from the Tiananmen Square 12 years ago. If there was a moment that the Chinese Communist Party was about to be overthrown, that was June 1989. As a result of that, what I call near-death experience, they've learned how to deal very, very quickly with emerging signs of social protest, especially organized social protest. Remember Falun Gong? The massive crackdown was launched because of the lessons from Tiananmen. And today, is Falun Gong a viable force against the Chinese state? I would say not. But 9-10 months ago, everybody thought, gee, the Communist Party was going to be overthrown by a group of spiritual meditators. And so I think the last set of remarks I want to make is that what would be the long-term scenario for China? If we exclude the possibility of near-term political reform or dramatic economic reform following WTO entry, I think the long-term scenario for China is most likely that of stagnation, of low growth, 4 to 5%, increasing corruption, declining governance, law and order breaks down in some areas and deteriorates in many other areas. People are unhappy with their government, but no real prospect, either for regime change or for regime collapse. And I think that's most likely to be the case. And in that case, China will more likely to become another Mexico of the 1980s rather than the Soviet Union of 1991. Thank you.
Thank you, Ming-Ching. Our final speaker is Liu Juning, who's a visiting scholar at Harvard University. He taught previously at Peking University, and his home is in Peking or Beijing. He's the author of several books, including Peking University and the Liberal Tradition in Modern China, which may be a short book, and The Phenomenon of Power, a Liberal Perspective. He's editor of Res Publica, the first academic journal in China since 1949, dedicated to liberal ideas. And liberal, by here we mean, of course, classical liberal, limited government, rule of law, and so on. He holds a PhD in political theory from Peking University. And in a book that Ted Galen Carpenter and I recently edited called China's Future Constructive Partner or Emerging Threat, Juning wrote, quote, "Whether China will be a constructive partner or an emerging threat will depend to a very great extent on the fate of liberalism in China. A liberal China will be a constructive partner. A nationalistic and authoritative China will be an emerging threat." I think that capsulizes the future of China very well in that choice. I commend Leo for his courage and frankness, and I'm glad to welcome him once again to Cato.
Thanks, Jim. As Jim said, I'm a scholar from China, and I want to go back. Therefore, I beg your understanding that if I can discuss with you very freely about the possible collapse of China, then we have no reason to worry about the collapse, since we can discuss freely. So, if my comment is not so straightforward or a little bit too general, I also beg your pardon. Let me begin with a short story or episode. About 3 to 4 weeks ago, a very renowned French philosophe, may I use the word philosophe, who has been dedicated to the deconstruction of the theoretical foundation of the free world for most of his time, made an academic tour to China's major academic institutions in Beijing and Shanghai, arranged by official Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. One of his repeating themes in his lectures is that he sees the specter of communism and Marxism are still wandering around the world, especially in China. He gives China the credit of providing most powerful boost to Marxism and communism after the collapse of USSR. He claims that Marxism is not dead. It lives decently well in China. And he encourages China to stay on this track as long as it can. Here is the response he got from one of his audience. If you do love Marxism and communism so much, why not live in a typical communist society such as North Korea and Cuba? Stop exporting the style of life that you can't afford to China. We've got enough of it. So, my comments start from the title of the book. What is going to collapse in China? Is it China as a country? No. Its land and the population will always be there. Is it China as a Confucian political order? No. It has been dismantled since a century ago. Or is it CCP or Chinese Communist Party? A lot of people say so, but I don't think so. The Chinese Communist Party will be there. And even after the substantial transition, we might have more than one Communist party, so it is not the collapse of Communist Party. In my view, what is going to collapse in China is the political establishment and the economic infrastructure of the ideology adored by the philosopher I mentioned in that short story. This coming collapse has even been recognized by the CCP leaders, of course not in a very frank way. In an interview by New York Times, the top leader confirmed that communism is not going to be realized in China and around the world in the near future, or not even in the long run. China's shift to socialist market economy is also part of the evidence or proof. So if the collapse is coming in China, it is not the end of Chinese civilization, but the fiasco of certain kind of ideas invented by some Western philosophers. The doom of the collapse is that China has chosen the option that has been rejected, falsified, neutralized in the West. More than this, China has been distancing itself away from the ideas and the practice that have materialized individual freedom and prosperity in the West, especially here in U.S. Despite the apparent coming collapse, there is also something that is on the rise in China. Even before the publication of Gordon's book, there have been a lot of debates about which direction China is moving toward. Some people even began to talk about the possibility of a China century. The mixing and confusing tendencies can at least partly be explained by the fact I call the fact as one man and two systems. No need to elaborate. It's very easy to judge or to tell where if there is vitality in today's China. It's not difficult to tell where it comes from. Does it come from the old regime, or does it come from the new system it has adopted 2 decades? It started to adopt 2 decades ago. So, in China, one system is rising, the other is setting or collapsing. During most of time in last century, a group of Chinese intellectuals, lots of them trained in France, just like Cambodians Pol Pot, thought that only Marxism could save China. And now people in China are talking about how China is saving its savior by resorting to the practice denounced by Marx. So if there is any lesson that we can learn from the coming collapse, it might be the best passive way to help China is not to export those ideas that is resulting in the coming collapse in China. The best positive way to help China is to share with China what has brought about freedom and prosperity in the West, in terms of ideas and practice, not in terms of finance. People might say the export of the ideas mentioned above is a past story of last century. But let me call your attention to another fact. In today's China, especially in the intellectual community, most of liberals are usually homegrown. Most new leftists and nationalists are trained in the West, not just in France, but also in the United States. We shall not only keep close watch on what is going to collapse in China, but also think about what will follow and what will follow the collapse and what can we do about it. Gordon's book helps a lot to know more about China's real problems is, and I hope more friends can help China find out the real remedy. Thanks.
Yep.
Yeah, as a former resident, my name is Joe Motherall from Pittsburgh. As a former resident of Taiwan, and a member of the American Chamber of Commerce there, we were following China's movement into accession of WTO quite closely. And I agree with you that some of the practices there are not going to fit with the WTO membership. So it begs the question, why in the world do they want to get in the WTO in the first place? I got one other question, just quickly. The investment from Taiwan was pretty high volume at one time. I just wondered where that stands right now. Thank you.
China's investment in Taiwan, to answer the easier question first, is still running at a fairly high pace. And the reason is that as Taiwanese society gets more expensive, the low-cost manufacturing tends to go to the mainland. And that trend will continue as Taiwan moves up the value chain. The more interesting question is, why would China ever want to be in the WTO in the first place? The stated reason, and the Communist Party is a very big organization, 63.5 million people, which means that there are probably about 50 million answers to that question. Zhu Rongji wants to be in the WTO because he thinks that that will speed reform. I think most people in the party leadership want to be in the WTO for the same reason they want to be in the UN and other world organizations. It's an unfortunate byproduct of 200 years of humiliation, as they put it, and so they just want to belong. You know, if they could belong to every organization, they would do that. Part of the problem is that the leaders in Beijing misperceive the ability of the state-owned enterprises and perhaps the state-owned banks to compete in the WTO era. It's like the Great Leap Forward, where 30 million peasants died, and they didn't die because the granaries were empty. The granaries were full. It's just that the Communist Party cadres in the villages couldn't report about the failures of the agricultural policies of the central government. So the granaries were full, and tens of millions of people died. Well, in a different way, it's sort of the same thing with SOEs. You know, Zhu Rongji says that his 3-year campaign, he's basically solved the problems of the SOEs, but that's basically nonsense. And I just don't think the SOEs are going to survive in the WTO. And I think it's a misperception of their ability to compete because cadres just can't tell the senior leaders about the problems. Also, many of the senior leaders themselves don't want to be in the WTO because they know that China can't compete.
Let me put some perspective on the SOEs, because we hear about the Chinese state-controlled economy and tend to think that that's about the entire Chinese economy. The truth of the matter is very, very different. SOE total output is about 30% of Chinese GDP, and most of that is in natural monopolies. Gas, petroleum, power generation, telecommunications, banks. These sectors will be affected, but not disastrously. What probably will take a big hit will be the remaining manufacturing sector in the SOE. That's probably no more than 5% of Chinese GDP. So give yourself some kind of overall picture as to what WTO means for China, because I think the government in Beijing is not suicidal enough to make a decision which many of them are sure will impact 85% of the Chinese economy.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you. My name is David Welker. I work for the U.S.-China Security Review Commission. Mr. Liu, thank you for your talk. I think the idea of one man, two systems is kind of interesting. The same guy doing two different things. But what I have a question more about is not that the numbers don't add up or that the numbers are faulty one way or the other. It's more the fact that economies around the world can defy gravity for a while based upon leadership that they have, either macro or in a free market economy. The leadership of companies adjust to the market. They keep their companies going. When markets improve, the market then rewards those companies. They grow again. And what I want to know about inside of China is how much more does the party still involve itself in the human capital questions inside of China? Access to higher education, access to management inside of state-owned enterprises, access to the regulatory bodies. I know that it is previously pervasive, but an indication whether or not China will survive is whether the human resources that China has is blessed with, a lucky country in that, whether or not those will be taken advantage of at any point in the near future.
Yeah. Do you want?
I just can give you what I know. I'm not an expert in this field. In China, the government keeps a hand on every on every university and even every school, to be exact. But there is a new tendency appearing in China. That is, the market are now competing for talented people with the government. So, because of the salary level of civil servants in China, it seems that the government is the government fails to take an upper hand. So eventually, even this tendency will I think will result in the underperformance of the government.
Sure.
No, I'm okay.
I mean, this question really puts the finger on the important problem, because the state really has not given up control of the SOEs. It still appoints the managers. It still determines important policies. Of course, there is more of a market flavor to many parts of the Chinese economy, but not all of them. Just to give you an example, they've been talking about stock options for managers of SOEs for about 7 years now, and they still essentially have made no progress. They've made some changes, but the important point is that the party still controls personnel decisions in most SOEs. What is worse is that now the party is trying to control the private enterprises, which we've heard today are the engine of growth. For the last 2 years, the party is trying to put its cells into the more important private enterprises. And this whole movement to admit private entrepreneurs in the party, many people say, oh, you know, isn't this terrific? The party's being modern. But what the party is trying to do is to control private enterprise by putting private entrepreneurs into the party where they can control them. And this is not my guess. This is what the party itself says. So the problem in WTO is that you have a competitive environment, which means you need to have managers to be able to react to the market. But SOEs and maybe even private enterprises in the future are going to be constrained by party policies and party decisions. And that is really the crux of the problem.
Why don't we go way in the back? Yeah.
Dan Griswold with the Cato Institute. One scenario the panelists haven't talked about is what if China's economic reforms succeed? They stay on the reform path, incomes continue to rise. You know, it's the scenario that we've seen in South Korea and Taiwan and that we've talked about here at Cato, that you create an educated, well-off middle class and they become the bottom-up force for more democratic reforms. Is that not a possibility, or what are the chances that the scenario we've seen in other countries and in Mexico most recently, where economic reforms have led to economic changes and consequent political reforms?
I went first last time.
Okay.
You go first this time.
Well, because this is supposed to be an advanced look at a corpse, so we're not going to do an exercise of what if something nice happens. I think whether China will become democratic will continue its path toward a real market economy. Depends on a whole series of issues, and I think one thing Gordon's book has done is to identify the next 3 to 5 years as the most critical period in which key decisions will have to be made. And I think on that score, many of us do agree with him. I think China has postponed a set of critical decisions for a long time. the postponement of those decisions has made the solution more elusive and politically more difficult. But suppose that the right set of choices that need to be made are made in the next 3 to 5 years. That is to say, continued structural adjustment, opening up the political system in a gradual manner, especially beefing up the legal system and separating the Communist Party gradually from certain functions of the state, developing checks and rules, and also empowering civil society to some degree. Then I think China will be on its course toward a more open and democratic society. Probably we're going to see major changes in, say, 10 to 15 years, but not necessarily within the next 5 to 10 years.
You talked about the option of, or scenario of what if things go right. Well, Min Shin-pei started out in his presentation by talking about low probability events. And if we want to think of low probability events, this is certainly one of them. I mean, there has been a lot of change in China since 1978, which is the beginning of the reform era. But the one thing that we forget is that most of that change occurred during Deng Xiaoping's tenure. And his ideas of fast growth no longer apply in China. It's been replaced by a gradualism and an orthodoxy of Jiang Zemin, where there has been a postponement of difficult questions. China has reformed, but it's only reformed as it's been forced to in many cases. And the image of the country is certainly much better what goes on in the economy, where the party still controls most segments of what happens. So it's very unlikely that there would be that they would start to wake up tomorrow and do everything right. But if they did, the problem is that they have this Marxist ideology and they're not about to give it up. So when you talk about Mexico or any of these other countries where there has been a growing middle class which has led to political reform, that's just not going to happen. The Chinese leaders, they have an ideology which not only gives them the right to rule, but it demands that they rule for all time to bring China to a perfect Marxist state. And even though many people in China, including many people in the party, may think that this is just absurd, where it counts, at the top of the party, they still believe all this nonsense. So you're not going to see the change that you're talking about.
Just a very brief answer. Those countries with successful transitional experience are not communist countries. None of these countries has a dominant communist party. I think that's the most important variable.
Well, we can test Gordon's thesis, I guess, by betting on it. Maybe Gordon's willing to take some bets. Yeah.
I'm Ralph Klump from the School of Advanced International Studies of Johns Hopkins University. I have just a very brief comment. I was struck by your comment about how only 1/3 of the students who've gone abroad to study from China have come back. You portrayed that as indicating that there's something wrong with the society there if only so few people come back. I had the opposite feeling because when I lived in Taiwan in the early 60s, there were 5,000 or 6,000 students who went to the United States, mostly for study every year. Only 5% came back for a number of years. So if 1/3 come back, I think that's not a bad percentage at this point.
Okay. Yep.
I'm Joe Winder with the Korea Economic Institute. I wanted to follow up on Dr. Pei's comment about the low portion of state-owned enterprises in percentage of GDP. Somebody mentioned Dr. Nick Lardy, and one of the points that he always makes is that even though their output is small, the percentage of employment is very, very large, particularly in urban centers. In fact, he uses a statistic, I think, is that 2/3 of urban center employment is still in SOEs. And if that's the case, a collapse of that 5% of GDP would have enormous political and social consequences. How do you reconcile that?
State sector employment is about 100 million. declining by 5% every year over the last 10 years. Used to be 120. And then of this 100 million, then we include teachers, doctors, government officials, real manufacturing sector employment will be smaller, will be a sort of small portion. I have not looked into sort of what constitutes, but my sort of guess is that it would be no more than half. So that's 50 million. It's a big number, but then we're talking about not instant unemployment for everybody. And the key is not how state sector adjusts. My feeling is that they're not going to adjust. The real key is where and how new employment will be found. That's the private sector. So it really depends on whether the Chinese government will have the set of right policy, the right set of policies to encourage private sector growth, to absorb displaced state sector workers.
Let's see. How about another question in the back? Anybody have a question from the back? Go ahead.
My name is Bert Ely, and I'm a banking consultant here in town. And this is a question for Mr. Chang. You talked quite a bit about China's accession to the World Trade Organization. To what extent do you think that China will try to cheat once it joins, and what will be the most likely ways in which it will cheat, such as continuing to subsidize the SOEs and engage in other activities? I find it hard to believe that they would be honest participants in the WTO.
Well, senior leaders tell us almost every few days that they will honor all the commitments in WTO. And I, for one, actually think that they're as good as their word. But of course, that's not the end of the story, because there is a very large group that will cheat. So you have officials in every province, every municipality, every city. They're going to do tomorrow what they do today, which is protect local industry. But multinationals, though, are going to have a much easier time with cheating in the WTO era for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of the rules just go, and it makes it more difficult to cheat. But there's one factor that we often forget, and that is that multinationals are often the beneficiary of cheating, not just the victim of it. And all we have to do is look at Carrefour, the French hypermarket operator. They built from scratch the second largest retail network in China in just a few years by ignoring every rule in China's playbook. And I think that experience you can see across the board from company to company. They do benefit from cheating. So at the end of the day, will cheating be a factor? Yeah, of course it will. But it won't be as big a factor as we now think that it will.
I know you're probably getting hungry, so why don't we limit to 2 more questions? How about the last row here? Yep.
Jia Qingguo from the Brookings Institution. In 1957, John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State at the time, said that China was a passing phase, right? And in 1989, Liu Bingyan, a prominent Chinese dissident, said China was going to collapse. And in between, a lot of people have predicted the collapse of China over time. The problem is China has not, and has become a threat to some people because of its economic growth. My point is that the real challenge is not whether China is going to collapse or not, citing the problems. We know there are many, many problems, dismal problems in China. But if you look at it historically, China has its worst moment before, much worse moments before, like in end of 1950s and the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. The Chinese government did not collapse over the year, during that time. And China, if you look at China today, China has never been more economically more efficient. Society has never been freer before. And Chinese government even now trying to introduce some elections in the grassroots area. So the real challenge now is how can we explain that China will collapse at this particular moment in the next few years, given the fact that China has never been better than before. Thank you.
I guess that question must be directed towards me. Yeah, okay. You talked about the Great Leap Forward, which was a disaster of monumental proportions, perhaps the worst famine in human history. And then the Cultural Revolution, which was maybe perhaps the most abnormal period in the 20th century. And China didn't collapse. China, the people, the peasants, workers, they really believed in their government then. They believed in Mao Zedong for a number of reasons. That's not true today. I mean, I know that you go back just 10, 15 years. Someone a couple weeks ago said to me that he went to China in 1985 and he came back and he was convinced that the country had only 2 more years. But the difference between 1957, 1966, or 1985 is that now China is joining the World Trade Organization, and the changes will be very, very important. You can't say that because the People's Republic hasn't collapsed in the past, that it won't collapse now. China's model of political development going back thousands and thousands of years is that you've got a dynasty, it really clamps down, and then all of a sudden, one day, to everybody's surprise, it disappears. I mean, we talk about there's nobody on the horizon who's going to bring down the modern Chinese state. But we have to remember that Sun Yat-sen only took about 10 years to bring down the Qing dynasty. And so the same things can happen today, especially with the economic turmoil and chaos of WTO mixed together with political indecision at the top. It's a very potent brew.
Gordon, it seems to me that every one of your arguments hinges on WTO entry. So without that event, it's an event, okay? It's not a problem. I tend to view this as a process. But in your argument, it has become the pivotal event on which the fate of the Chinese state and the Communist Party regime hangs. So if I were to take that factor out of your equation, what would be your argument?
Well, I wouldn't say that China would collapse, at least not now. I mean, the system there, for very important reasons, just is not going to survive WTO or no WTO. But what WTO does is it brings forward the collapse. And so I believe that if there were no WTO, this system could go on for a very long time. Mao Zedong created an abnormal system, and he had the wisdom to create the walls to wall off China from the rest of the world so that his edicts, he could defy gravity, as you talked about, behind these walls. But the problem is, as China opens up, then the same forces that apply around the world, economically, politically, have also got to apply in China. And unfortunately, Mao Zedong's abnormal system still exists.
Okay, how about one more question?
This guy over here really wants.
Okay. Go ahead.
I can talk loud. I've got a very easy one here. Assuming that your theory is correct and there is an imminent collapse of the Chinese Communist Party, do you believe in the midterm, 10 years, it will necessitate social disintegration, political chaos, and serious economic downturn? Or could Professor Liu's theory of a more optimistic theory of a more liberal but still cohesive society prevail?
I'm afraid that it's the first. You know, I don't want the Chinese state to collapse precisely because of the reasons you identified. There will be upheaval in all probability. People will get hurt. Everyone would like, or almost everybody in this world, would like to see a gradual evolution in the modern Chinese state to a more open and humane society. But that's just because we want that doesn't necessarily mean that it will occur. And the problem is that you have a political leadership, which demonstrated in 1989, and it's demonstrated since then, that is quite brittle. So I don't see that it gradually giving in to the demands of the people. It's going to hold on tight for as long as it can. And then eventually one day, as in all Chinese governments in the past, it just disappears.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you all for attending. I would also like to thank the they're clapping for themselves. I also like to thank the panelists, Gordon and Ming Xing and Juning for coming over and having a very interesting discussion on a very important topic. Now, we're going to have a reception and luncheon up in the Winter Garden. To get up there, you have to go past the book stand, so Gordon ought to scoot around there to grab you. But thank you again, and we hope to see you in the future. Bye-bye.